In this video, we're going to look at a few tips and tricks for fixing underexposed photos in Lightroom and Photoshop. Now, with this image here, we've got an obvious problem. The land and the foreground are too dark compared to the sky. The sky is properly exposed, but the foreground is underexposed. And this is a challenge you'll often find with landscapes, is in balancing the sky with the land. So in Lightroom here, we have a few options. The first option, and it's always worth trying this, we can simply up the shadows like this, and we could perhaps just drop the highlights a little bit. We could perhaps up the exposure a touch, and very quickly we're able to reveal a bit more detail in the image. We might want to increase clarity a little bit there as well, and also perhaps just tweak the temperature and the tint. So you can see very quickly we're able to come up with a more balanced photo, but this sort of blanket approach can sometimes leave the image looking a little bit over processed. Now, another approach might be to use local adjustments. So I'm going to reset all of these settings here. I can just hold Alt and click on these fields here to reset them. And this time I'm going to use the adjustment brush. So I'll grab the adjustment brush from the toolbar over here, and I'm going to go down to the brush settings down here and make sure auto mask is checked. That way, when I paint, the brush will seek out the edges for me, so I can quickly target the mountain range here without sort of seeping into the sky too much. So I'm able to create quite a precise adjustment here without the need for really precise painting. So I can quickly select those mountains, and I'll also paint over the trees here and the foreground like this. And often targeting these areas with local adjustments can give a more natural looking result than trying to just use those shadows, highlights and exposure sliders in the basic panel. So I'll quickly whiz over all of these areas, and I can hit O to turn the mask overlay off, and then I can go up to my adjustment brush tonal settings here. I can just double click any existing settings to reset them, and I could perhaps just try lifting the exposure. Let's just pull out a bit more detail out of the shadows, and let's perhaps try increasing clarity a little bit too. And that's looking better. Now we can of course use the opposite approach over the sky here. So I can grab the graduated filter. Again, I can double click any settings to reset them. I can drag down from the sky towards the land while holding shift to keep those lines perfectly horizontal, and then I can just drop the exposure, perhaps drop the highlights a little bit to make the clouds and the sky look a little bit more dramatic here like this. And of course we can also go back to our basic settings here, and let's perhaps just warm the image slightly. Let's perhaps just lift the overall exposure and add a touch of contrast. And another option we have available to us is to target color ranges and adjust the luminosity that way. So for example, with the trees here, what we can do is go into our HSL panel here. We can target luminance, grab the little target tool here, and then click and drag upwards over the trees. And you can see that allows me to lift the luminance of the yellows and the greens here to boost the trees and make them much brighter. I can similarly perhaps drag down over the mountains there to just darken down the oranges slightly. And that's looking better, but I think the white balance is still slightly off. So I'm going to go back into my settings here. Now, a quick trick for white balance, we can up the vibrance and the saturation to 100. And that just helps us to see if the colors are slightly wrong, and then we can adjust them. So I think I might need to shift the colors slightly towards green here, and also just tweak the tint until my mix of colors looks a bit more natural. And then with that done, I can just double click the saturation and vibrance sliders to reset them to their default values. In fact, I might want to just push saturation up a little bit. So that's another way we can fix underexposure, by using those local adjustments and color mixer tools. Now we're going to look at a third way, and this also involves adjusting the sky and the land independently of one another. But rather than using these Lightroom tools, we can get more precise in Photoshop. So what I'm going to do now is go back and just remove that local adjustment that we made a second ago. And instead what I'm going to do is go back to my basic panel and process the image to boost the land here. I'm not really worried about the sky at all. So I'm just going to make sure I've got a nice amount of detail and color in the land there. In fact, I could just drag down with a graduated filter to darken down the mountains slightly more like this. Let's remove that other adjustment there. And I'll perhaps just lift the shadows so that I can pull a bit of detail out of those trees there. So now I've processed my image for the land. What I can do is open it up into Photoshop. So I can go to Photo, we'll go to Edit In, and we'll go to Open as Smart Object in Photoshop. Then once open, I can go to my Layers panel here. I'll right click that layer and choose New Smart Object via Copy. And you can see that gives me a second Smart Object layer. Now I can double click the thumbnail on this layer to open up the image into Camera Raw. And this gives me the same controls as Lightroom. And I can use these to process the image a second time to enhance the sky. So I'm going to drag exposure downwards this time. And let's tweak the highlights. And perhaps boost the vibrance. And perhaps just shift the temperature slightly more towards the warmer tones, just to give it that sort of nice sunset feel. So I'm happy with that, so I'll hit OK to apply. So now I've got two versions of my image here. One processed for the sky, the other processed for the land. Now we can use the superior selection tools in Photoshop here to combine the two versions of our image. In fact, all I need to do here is highlight that image of the land there. Then I can go to select sky, and Photoshop will use machine learning here to isolate the sky for me. Then all I have to do is highlight that top layer and click the add layer mask icon to add a mask that blends the land with the sky here. Now at the moment it's looking a little bit unnatural, but I can of course just lower the opacity of that layer to tone it down until I get the right sort of effect. And if you find it still looks slightly unnatural where the sky meets the land, you can always highlight the layer mask thumbnail there. We grab the brush tool, set our foreground color to black, and I'll set my opacity to 20% by hitting 2 on my keyboard here. And I'll just paint to gradually fade out the lower part of the sky here where it meets the horizon like this. And if I toggle that top layer off and on, you can see the difference that makes. So there we go. That's a few tips and tricks for fixing underexposed images using Lightroom and Photoshop.